He lost his home to fraudsters and was left standing in the rain with his daughter. No one stopped, except a famous lawyer. What happened next changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The city that evening looked as though it had been washed in sorrow. Heavy clouds pressed low over the skyline, their bellies swollen with endless rain. Water poured down in relentless sheets, cascading off rooftops, pooling along curbs, drumming against car hoods, and sliding down the smooth faces of marble buildings. It was the sort of storm that made people rush faster through the streets, heads bowed under umbrellas, their minds focused only on the promise of warmth waiting behind office doors or apartment walls. The heart of the city glowed faintly against the gray sky, neon signs blinking through the downpour, while the grand courthouse loomed at its center like an eternal sentinel. Its granite columns stood tall and severe, its steps polished by years of footsteps, its facade radiating power and permanence. Here, justice was meant to live. Here, the wealthy and the influential gathered to decide the fates of others. And yet, at the very edge of its manicured lawn, beneath the shadow of an old linden tree, sat a picture that could not have belonged to such a place of grandeur. The tree's branches drooped under the weight of water, leaves trembling, raindrops splattering to the ground in heavy bursts. At its base, where the soil had turned to mud, sat a man and a child. They looked small against the vast backdrop of stone and glass towers, fragile and forgotten in a world that passed them by. The man, his shoulders hunched against the cold, tried to shelter the little girl with the worn fabric of his jacket. His hair clung to his forehead, streaked with water, his face marked by exhaustion and quiet defeat. Beside him lay a rucksack, faded and frayed, with one sleeve of a stuffed bear poking out of the zipper. The bear's once soft fur had turned rough and patchy, its button eyes dulled with time, yet it remained clutched tightly in the small hands of the girl, who pressed it against her chest as if it were the last remnant of comfort in her world. Her name was Lily, and she was 8 years old. She had known the rhythm of lullabies, the smell of warm bread in the mornings, the safety of a small room that she called her own. But those things had been stolen away in silence, taken not by fire or storm, but by men with cold smiles and false promises. The apartment they had been promised never existed. Her father, Daniel, had handed over every dollar he had managed to save, desperate to secure them a home, and the money had vanished into the abyss of a fraudulent company. By the time he realized the truth, their old landlord had locked the door of their former dwelling, and there had been nowhere else to go. For weeks, Daniel had carried Lily from shelter to shelter, office to office, begging for mercy, for a corner to stay, for a chance to rebuild. But doors had closed in his face. Clipped voices had told him there was no space, no funds, no way to help. And now, when his strength was nearly gone, when his body ached with weariness and hunger gnawed at his stomach, he found himself sitting under the rain, the courthouse looming above him like a silent judge. Daniel had once been a proud man, steady and reliable. He had worked long hours at a modest job, had built routines for his daughter, had believed that if he tried hard enough, the world would at least allow him to provide the basics. Now that belief was cracking. Yet even as the storm drenched them both, even as his heart broke for what he could not give, he kept his arm around Lily's small shoulders. He pulled her closer, feeling the fragile warmth of her body, and told himself he would not let despair show on his face. A father could not crumble, not here, not in front of her. Lily sat silently against him. Her lips moved, almost imperceptibly, as she hummed a lullaby she half remembered, a tune she had once heard her mother sing before her memory had faded into childhood haze. The song was barely audible against the thunder and the rain, but it gave her courage. In the bare press to her chest, she found a substitute for everything she had lost. She trusted Daniel completely. In her eyes, he was still strong, still capable, still her shield. Yet her small body trembled, and Daniel felt every shiver like a blade. The contrast between them and their surroundings was almost cruel. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened and closed with a steady rhythm as lawyers and clerks hurried in and out, some with briefcases, some with umbrellas, all with lives to return to. Cars lined the curb, sleek and shining despite the storm, their owners stepping out quickly to avoid the wet. Wealth and order continued its procession just yards away, as if the man and the child beneath the tree did not exist. People glanced at them and turned away just as quickly, refusing to let the sight settle in their minds. Misery was easier to ignore when it did not force its way into one's home. It was in this moment, when despair seemed like the only companion left, that another figure arrived. A black car, long and polished, pulled up to the curb. Its engine purred low, and from the back seat emerged a man whose presence carried authority like a second skin. Michael Harrison stepped onto the wet pavement, his shoes striking the puddles with careful grace. He held an umbrella over his head, his tailored suit flawless despite the storm. His reputation preceded him everywhere, one of the most accomplished attorneys in the country, a man who had risen from modest beginnings to command the respect of the most powerful clients. His name was whispered in courtrooms, praised in magazines, sought after by those who could afford his exorbitant fees. To most, he embodied triumph. Michael's gaze, as he moved toward the courthouse steps, was sharp and purposeful. He was used to storms, used to deadlines, used to the weight of lives hanging on his words. Nothing rattled him. Nothing made him hesitate, until his eyes caught the sight beneath the linden tree. For a heartbeat, he thought his mind was playing tricks. A man, soaked through, huddled against the bark, shielding a little girl with his body. The child's eyes looked out from beneath strands of wet hair, wide and trusting. The bear clutched in her arms. Something deep in Michael's chest clenched. The courthouse, the rain, the people hurrying by. All of it seemed to blur at the edges. He was no longer standing in front of the building that symbolized his success. He was back in another time, another place, where he too had once felt the sting of cold rain, where his mother had clutched his hand and whispered that things would get better, even when she did not believe it herself. Michael had buried those memories long ago. He had built walls of steel and marble around them, covering them with degrees, accolades, and victories. But the sight of the man and his daughter tore a hole straight through those defenses. The thunder rolled above, and yet inside him a different storm began to rage, one of recognition, of shame, of forgotten empathy. He lingered on the courthouse steps, torn between the life he had built and the truth now sitting just yards away. He could have turned, walked inside, continued with his day, and no one would have thought less of him. No one expected Michael Harrison, the untouchable attorney, to stop for two drenched souls hiding beneath a tree. And yet he could not move. His hand tightened on the umbrella handle, his eyes fixed on them. The rain pounded the pavement, but it was not the sound of water he heard. It was the faint echo of his own childhood hunger, the remembered ache of being overlooked, the whisper of a voice telling him that wealth meant nothing if it did not serve humanity. For a long moment, he simply stood, the storm rushing around him, the courthouse glowing behind him, and the fragile figures trembling beneath the tree before him. And in that moment, though he did not yet know what he would do, Michael Harrison felt the first crack in the armor that had shielded his heart for decades. Michael stood frozen on the courthouse steps longer than he had intended. The storm continued to beat down upon the city, sending streams of water down the polished stone, but he no longer felt hurried. Something in him had shifted the moment his eyes met the soaked and fragile figures beneath the linden tree. The memory of his own childhood pressed too heavily upon him to be ignored, and for once in his carefully ordered life, the urgency of meetings and the weight of schedules faded into the background. He closed his umbrella with a decisive snap, tucked it under his arm, and moved toward the man and his daughter. Each step through the rain felt deliberate, like crossing a threshold he had avoided for too long. Daniel felt the movement before he saw it. He turned his head slightly, instinctively pulling Lily closer against his side, as though to protect her from whatever stranger approached. His pride ached. He hated to be seen in this condition, hated the thought of his daughter's suffering being put on display. Yet there was something different about this man, something in the steadiness of his stride and the gravity of his presence that made Daniel pause. He did not have the energy to protest when Michael offered a hand, nor did he resist when Michael gestured toward the courthouse. For Lily's sake, he would endure the humiliation of being led inside like someone who could not stand on his own. The air inside the courthouse was a world apart from the storm outside. Warmth radiated from polished wooden panels, and light glowed from chandeliers overhead. The floor gleamed, and the soft murmur of legal clerks filled the space with a hum of orderly life. Here, justice was debated and fortunes were defended. But rarely did such walls witness the rawness of human desperation in its simplest form. Staff paused as Michael ushered the drenched pair through the doors. Their eyes widened, surprised that the renowned attorney, a man who seldom acknowledged strangers, was now leading in two figures who looked as though they had been plucked from the gutters. Some whispered among themselves, but no one dared question him aloud. Michael guided them toward a quiet corner, where an attendant rushed to bring blankets and towels at his curt request. Daniel tried to refuse the comfort at first, shaking his head, as though accepting it would erase the last shreds of his dignity. But Lily's teeth were chattering, her small frame shivering uncontrollably. With a heavy sigh, Daniel allowed the blanket to be draped over them both. Lily burrowed into the warmth instantly, her face lighting with the smallest flicker of relief. Michael watched her expression carefully and felt a pang deep in his chest, the kind he had trained himself to suppress in court, but could not deny now. Food was brought next, simple but warm, and Lily's eyes widened when the tray was set before her. She looked to her father for permission before touching anything. Daniel gave a small nod, his own hunger gnawing at him, but his instinct always to let her eat first. Michael saw this quiet act, saw the restraint in Daniel's posture, and something hardened within him. He had witnessed countless power struggles, betrayals, and greed in his career. But this was something purer, a father sacrificing without complaint. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and heavy. Slowly, haltingly, he shared their story. He told of the months he had spent saving, of the promises made by a slick realtor, of the paperwork that looked official enough to trust. He explained how the company had disappeared overnight, leaving behind no trace but the shattered hopes of those who had handed over their savings. By the time he realized it was all a facade, he and Lily had already lost their former home. With nowhere else to go, they had carried what little they owned on their backs. For days they drifted, each night searching for a place to keep out the cold, each day growing weaker. The linden tree had simply been the last spot where exhaustion overtook them. Michael listened without interruption, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Every word Daniel spoke tugged at a memory he had thought long buried. He knew these schemes existed. He had read about them, seen them in reports, sometimes even defended clients accused of similar practices. But hearing it now, not as a case study, but as the lived ruin of a man and his child. It became something else entirely. He realized with a clarity that stung that his own career, his victories in court, had sometimes helped shield people not unlike the ones who had orchestrated Daniel's ruin. When Daniel's voice faltered, Michael filled the silence with thought rather than words. He recognized immediately that this was not an isolated case. A fraud of this scale was rarely confined to a single victim. Behind Daniel and Lily, there were likely dozens, perhaps hundreds of other families, crushed under the same weight. It was a web spun deliberately to ensnare the vulnerable, and Daniel had simply been one of many caught in its threads. Daniel lowered his head, ashamed at his own helplessness, but Michael saw something more than shame in him. He saw the raw determination of a man who still refused to give up entirely, who had clung to his daughter even when everything else was stripped away. That determination sparked something in Michael's own mind. He could no longer allow himself to be the man who walked by, the attorney who only took cases for profit and prestige. The decision formed slowly but firmly within him. It would be costly, perhaps disastrous for his reputation, to involve himself in something like this. He had contracts with clients who thrived in the very industries that produced such schemes. To challenge them would mean stepping out of the comfortable role he had built for himself and into a fight where he would stand against powerful enemies. Yet the thought of doing nothing filled him with a greater dread. The image of Lily trembling in her father's arms would not leave him. That night, long after Daniel and Lily had been taken to a safe room with beds and fresh clothes, Michael remained in his office. The storm had finally quieted outside, but its echo lingered in his chest. He spread papers across his desk, searching through contacts and case histories, piecing together fragments of names he remembered from similar frauds. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that this was not only about helping one man and his daughter. It was about dismantling something that preyed on the weak and thrived because no one powerful enough cared to intervene. For Daniel, the kindness of the day was almost unbearable. He sat on the narrow cot provided to him, watching his daughter finally drift to sleep under clean blankets. Her breathing was steady for the first time in days, her face peaceful. He had fought so hard to hold everything together, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe in the rare sensation of safety. Pride still burned at the edges of his heart, whispering that he should never have needed to rely on a stranger's charity. Yet gratitude swelled larger, tempered by the knowledge that his daughter was warm. For her sake, he would accept this fragile mercy. Michael returned to check on them before leaving for the night. He stood in the doorway, observing the scene quietly. Daniel sat upright, alert despite his exhaustion, while Lily lay curled against her pillow. It was not wealth, not luxury, but it was life. It was survival. Michael's eyes lingered on the small, stuffed bear clutched in Lily's arms. That bear was more than a toy. It was the symbol of everything she had carried with her through loss and hunger, the piece of her world that had endured when everything else was taken. He realized then that her trust in her father, and now in him, was something he could not betray. When Michael finally walked back into the rain, his decision was no longer uncertain. He would take this case, not for fame or profit, but because it mattered. He would trace the threads of the fraud, expose those who had orchestrated it, and use his influence not to protect the powerful, but to defend the voiceless. The man beneath the linden tree and his little girl had awakened something long dormant within him, something that demanded action. The storm had weakened, leaving behind puddles that reflected the city lights in broken fragments. As he stepped into his waiting car, Michael felt a strange heaviness in his chest, not of doubt, but of responsibility. For the first time in years, his path was not guided by ambition, but by conviction. And though he did not know yet what battles awaited him, he knew that he had already crossed the line that separated the man he had been from the man he was about to become. The night after Michael had made his decision stretched into the early hours of morning, yet sleep never came to him. He sat surrounded by files and notes, fragments of old cases scattered across his desk, the hum of a desk lamp his only companion. Outside, the city slept beneath a veil of wet streets and fading storm clouds, but in his mind, a storm of a different kind raged stronger than any thunder could. The image of Daniel and Lily was fixed in his thoughts, a silent reminder that this was no longer about abstract law or detached arguments. It was about people, fragile and real, whose lives had been fractured by greed. At dawn, Michael began his work. He tapped into every resource at his disposal, calling in favors from contacts who owed him for past victories, sifting through public records with an eye sharpened by years of legal battles. Patterns emerged slowly, but they were there. Companies that existed only on paper, offices that closed overnight, signatures repeated across contracts by men who could not be found. Piece by piece, he uncovered the framework of a network designed not to house families, but to exploit their desperation. And with every thread he pulled, he realized the scale was larger than he had imagined. By the end of the first week, Michael had a wall of evidence that pointed to a chain of fraud, far beyond Daniel's single case. Dozens of families had been caught in the same trap, each with a story not unlike Daniel's, each with belongings stuffed into bags, children clutching the remnants of their innocence. Some had fled the city in shame. Others had been absorbed into shelters, or worse. This was not a series of unfortunate mistakes. It was a business, calculated and cold, and it thrived because no one powerful enough had bothered to stop it. Until now. But as his investigation deepened, so too did the shadows around him. A name appeared on a contract that struck Michael with a jolt, a corporation whose leader was one of his most influential clients, a man whose fortune depended on the constant churn of property deals. For years, Michael had defended this man's interests, ensuring loopholes were found, contracts held, profits secured. To move against him now would not only sever a lucrative relationship, but would invite retaliation of the harshest kind. The realization tightened around Michael like a noose, and for the first time he hesitated. His hesitation did not last long. Each time doubt whispered to him, he recalled Daniel's stooped figure and Lily's shivering body beneath the linden tree. He thought of the stuffed bear held tightly in her arms, a symbol of all that was left of her world, and he asked himself what his silence would cost. To remain still was to accept that children like her would continue to lose their homes while men in tailored suits profited. The thought was unbearable. Whatever risk awaited him, he would endure it. Daniel, too, began to change as the days passed. In the safety Michael had provided, his strength slowly returned. He was no longer merely a man bent under the weight of loss. He became a partner in the fight. He scoured old emails, gathered testimonies from other victims he had met on his journey, and pressed them into Michael's hands. At first, shame had kept him quiet, unwilling to show others the depth of his failure. But now, with Lily sleeping in warmth instead of rain, he found new courage. Every piece of evidence he uncovered was another step toward reclaiming his dignity, another way to prove to his daughter that he had not given up. Lily herself blossomed in the safety of those days. She no longer trembled constantly with cold. She began to sketch pictures on scraps of paper, drawing little houses with chimneys and windows filled with light. She showed them proudly to her father, and though he smiled faintly, his eyes glistened with tears when she was not looking. Michael saw those drawings too, and they filled him with a sense of urgency he had never felt in court. This case was not about winning. It was about ensuring that those pictures could one day become reality. As Michael prepared to bring the case forward, the pressure mounted. He received phone calls cloaked in politeness, but edged with warning, reminding him of the clients who had built his career. Whispers circulated in the courthouse halls that he was betraying his own kind, risking his standing in circles where reputation was everything. Colleagues shook their heads, some out of disbelief, others in veiled disdain. The easy path was clear. Drop the matter. Return to the comfort of wealthy clients. Pretend the family under the tree had never existed. Yet each warning only seemed to strengthen his resolve. The trial, when it began, was unlike any Michael had fought before. He stood not beside corporate magnates, but before a gallery of families who had lost everything. Their faces carried the same mixture of despair and cautious hope he had first seen in Daniel. He presented the evidence with a precision honed over years, but this time there was more in his voice than cold logic. There was conviction, sharpened by empathy, steady and unyielding. He wove together stories and facts, transforming legal documents into a narrative of injustice that could not be ignored. The opposition was formidable. The accused were represented by attorneys of equal skill, backed by fortunes that seemed endless. They questioned witnesses, challenged documents, painted the victims as careless or naive. They tried to break Daniel on the stand, probing his pride, suggesting that he should have known better, that his misfortune was his own fault. Michael watched as Daniel clenched his fists, his jaw tight, but he did not falter. He spoke of his daughter, of the promises made and broken, of the nights spent wandering with nowhere to go. His voice did not crack. For the first time in weeks, he felt strong again. Each day of the trial was a battle. Michael endured attacks on his character, insinuations that he had switched sides out of opportunism. His own past cases were dredged up, twisted into accusations of hypocrisy. The media followed every step, some praising his bravery, others mocking him for what they called a reckless crusade. Yet he pressed forward, bolstered by the sight of Lily sitting quietly in the gallery, her bear tucked in her arms, her eyes fixed on him with a trust that carried more weight than any verdict. The turning point came when Michael uncovered a set of hidden records, buried deep in financial statements. They revealed the direct transfer of stolen funds into the accounts of the very corporation tied to his former client. The evidence was undeniable, the kind that even the most skilled defense could not twist away. Presenting it in court felt like driving a blade through years of deception. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scratching of pens as the press scribbled down every word. The opposition faltered, their confidence cracking under the weight of truth. The judge's stern face softened just slightly as he acknowledged the depth of the scheme. And for Michael, the moment carried more than victory. It was the release of years of buried guilt, the vindication of every family who had been silenced, the answer to the child song beneath the rain. By the final day of the trial, when the decision was read aloud, the courtroom held its breath. The fraudsters were declared guilty. Restitution was ordered, their properties seized, their empire dismantled. Families would receive compensation, not enough to erase the scars, but enough to begin again. Applause broke out in the gallery, restrained at first, then swelling as relief and gratitude spilled forth. Michael stood still through it all, his posture steady but his chest heavy with something he had not felt in years. He had won, but more importantly, he had fought for something real. He looked toward Daniel, who sat with Lily on his lap, her small arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Daniel's eyes met his, and no words were needed. In that silent exchange was the acknowledgement of everything they had endured together, the gratitude of a father who had found an ally in the moment he least expected. As Michael left the courthouse that evening, the sky was no longer heavy with storm. It had cleared into a wide expanse of pale blue, streaked with the fading colors of sunset. He felt the exhaustion of the battle settle into his bones, yet beneath it ran a current of peace. He had stood against power and chosen truth. He had risked reputation and found something greater. The fight was not over. There would always be more battles, more injustices, but he had crossed the line he could never retreat from. And as he walked down the steps, where he had first seen them beneath the linden tree, he felt a certainty grow inside him. This was no longer just their story. It was his as well, and it would guide the rest of his life. The trial was over, but the echo of its battles lingered in Michael's mind long after the courtroom had emptied. The sound of the gavel striking still reverberated inside him, not merely as the end of a case, but as the beginning of something he had not dared to hope for. Change. The fraudsters had been convicted, their carefully constructed empire dismantled, their ill-gotten wealth seized and redirected to those they had deceived. For the families who had suffered, the verdict meant restitution and the chance to start again. For Daniel and Lily, it meant the end of the uncertainty that had haunted them every night they spent wandering through the storm. And for Michael, it meant the completion of a transformation he had not sought, but could no longer deny. In the days that followed the verdict, the courthouse quieted. Journalists shifted their attention to newer scandals, and the corridors no longer buzzed with whispers about Michael's crusade. Yet in homes across the city, life slowly began to stitch itself back together. Families who had been forced into shelters received the first payments of compensation. Small apartments were rented, children were enrolled back in schools, and kitchens once again filled with the simple aroma of warm meals. It was not wealth that had been restored, but dignity, and that dignity was more precious than any sum of money. Daniel and Lily were among the first to see the tangible fruits of the judgment. They were offered a modest apartment, plain in design, but sturdy and secure, with walls that held warmth and windows that opened to let in sunlight. The space was not large, but to them it felt expansive, not because of its size, but because it represented safety. Daniel walked through the empty rooms with reverence, his hand brushing against the smooth paint of the walls, as though he were touching something sacred. He had once feared his daughter would never again know the comfort of a home. Now he stood on the threshold of a new life, and gratitude swelled within him until it was almost unbearable. Lily's joy was even greater. She ran through the rooms barefoot, her laughter ringing off the walls, her stuffed bear clutched tightly in one hand. She examined every corner, as though she were discovering a treasure. The small alcove where her bed would go, the windowsill where she could sit and watch the world outside, the space where she imagined her drawings could hang. For her, the apartment was not merely a shelter, it was the canvas upon which she could begin painting her future. And though she did not fully understand the battle that had been fought on her behalf, she knew instinctively that her father had not failed her, and that Michael had stood beside them when they had been most alone. Daniel wasted no time in rebuilding his life. With his dignity partially restored, he pursued work with renewed determination. It was not easy, but through a combination of persistence and Michael's connections, he found employment that allowed him to provide for his daughter. Each morning he rose early, prepared her breakfast, and walked her to school before beginning his own day. Each evening they returned to their small apartment, where routine began to replace uncertainty, and the shadows of their ordeal gradually faded. For the first time in many months, Daniel could look at his reflection without flinching. He had been broken, but not destroyed, and in Lily's smile he saw proof that he had succeeded in giving her a second chance. For Michael, the conclusion of the trial brought both relief and restlessness. He had won the battle, yet he felt no inclination to return to the life he had lived before. The cases that had once defined him, the contracts and corporate negotiations that had filled his days, now seemed hollow compared to the faces of the families who had thanked him with tears in their eyes. He found himself spending more time away from the grandeur of his office, more time in places where people lived ordinary lives. And each time he visited Daniel and Lily, each time he saw their new apartment, he felt something stir within him that no amount of wealth or prestige had ever given him. Peace. It was during one such visit that Lily approached him with an expression of solemn determination. She held out her stuffed bear, worn and frayed, its seams stretched from years of affection. For a child, such a gift was monumental. It was the one object she had carried through hunger and storms, the one constant that had kept her anchored when the world had turned against her. Daniel moved to stop her, unwilling to let her part with something so precious, but Lily's resolve did not waver. She placed the bear in Michael's hands, her small fingers brushing against his as she whispered that it was for luck, so he would never forget what he had done for them. Michael stood silent for a long moment, the bear resting heavily in his palm. Its patched fur and dulled eyes carried more weight than the finest awards he had ever received. He realized then that this simple gesture meant more than any headline, more than any verdict. It was trust, pure and unfiltered, given freely by a child who had every reason to fear the world, but chose instead to believe in his kindness. The bear became his most valuable possession, a constant reminder of the night beneath the linden tree and the decision that had altered the course of his life. Weeks later, Michael found himself drawn back to that same tree. The storm had long since passed, and the ground beneath its branches had dried. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering golden patterns across the grass. It was here that he had first seen them, broken and soaked, a picture of despair that had pierced the armor he had spent a lifetime constructing. Now, as he stood beneath its branches again, the memory returned with vivid clarity. But the scene before him was different. Daniel stood tall, his shoulders no longer bent by shame, but squared with quiet pride. Lily skipped beside him, her face alight with joy, her hand clasped tightly in her father's. They stopped when they saw Michael, and though no words were spoken at first, the silence was filled with gratitude. Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he could not put into words. His eyes glistened with emotion, but his expression was steady, a mixture of humility and strength. Lily stood at his side, her free hand waving slightly, her eyes shining with the same trust she had shown that first night when she had looked out from under the tree and seen hope where she least expected it. Michael returned the gesture with a nod, his throat too tight for speech. He looked at them and knew with certainty that their story had changed his own. The linden tree had been a witness to despair, but now it bore witness to renewal. The place where suffering had seemed insurmountable was now the ground where compassion had taken root and blossomed into something enduring. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps in the distance, Michael felt a profound sense of clarity. His wealth and career had once defined him, but neither had given him the fulfillment he felt now. What mattered was not the cases he had won for the powerful, but the single act of choosing compassion over convenience. It was a lesson he would carry forward, guiding him in ways he had never imagined. The three of them stood together for a while beneath the tree, the air warm and calm. No rain fell, no storm threatened. Instead, the world seemed momentarily at peace, as though acknowledging the journey they had endured. Michael knew that the battles of life would continue, that injustice would always exist, but he also knew that kindness, when chosen deliberately, had the power to change lives. and sometimes it even had the power to change the heart of a man who thought he had lost the capacity to feel. When at last they parted, Daniel and Lily walked toward their new home, their silhouettes framed by the fading light of day. Michael remained for a moment longer, the stuffed bear tucked safely into his coat. He gazed at the courthouse steps, then back at the tree, and felt a deep calm settle over him. For all the victories he had claimed in his career, this was the one that mattered most. It was not a triumph of law alone, but of humanity, a reminder that the choice to see and to act could transform despair into hope. As the evening descended and the city lights flickered to life, Michael turned away from the tree and began his walk home. Each step carried with it the quiet assurance that he had been changed forever. The storm that had once raged was gone, replaced by a golden stillness. And in that stillness, beneath the memory of rain and the echo of laughter, a new life had begun, not only for Daniel and Lily, but for him as well. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.